Outside the towering walls of a bustling city hospital, a small figure curled up under the glow of a dim street light every night. It was a puppy, no older than a few months, with fur that was once golden but now matted and dull from days of exposure to the harsh elements. Rain or shine, cold or warmth, the little dog stayed there, his tiny body shivering against the cool pavement, eyes fixed on the hospital entrance. His presence was a mystery, yet he seemed determined, as though he had a purpose no one could understand. The hospital staff noticed him almost immediately. Nurses whispered to each other during their shifts about the stray dog who refused to leave. Some patients, peeking out of their windows late at night, caught glimpses of his small silhouette under the streetlight. It wasn't uncommon for a stray to linger around the city, but this one was different. He didn't beg for food or attention. He wasn't scared of the occasional shouting from passers-by trying to shoo him away. He simply stayed, night after night, waiting for something or someone. The hospital was a place of life and loss, of hope and heartbreak. Inside its walls, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save lives, often rushing past the small puppy without a second glance. But one doctor, in particular, couldn't ignore the dog's persistence. He first noticed the puppy during a late-night shift when he stepped outside to get some air. The sight tugged at his heart, a creature so small, so fragile, sitting there all alone in the cold. He thought it might just be a coincidence, that maybe the dog would wander off the next day. But it didn't. For weeks, the puppy became a silent companion to those who paid attention. Some staff members began leaving scraps of food or bowls of water for him, but he never touched them while anyone was watching. His behavior was puzzling. He seemed more interested in the hospital doors than the kindness of strangers. One evening, as the doctor walked to his car after an exhausting day, he saw the puppy again. The little dog was curled tightly into a ball, his small body barely protected from the biting wind. The doctor paused, crouching down to get a closer look. "What are you waiting for, little guy?" he murmured softly. The puppy's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Instead, he lifted his head and stared at the doctor with eyes so deep and filled with emotion that it stopped him in his tracks. It was as if the dog was trying to say something, to convey a message no one could understand. The doctor couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, thoughts of the puppy haunted him. Why was it there? Was it waiting for someone? Did it lose its owner? The questions swirled in his head, keeping him awake far longer than his already long day should have allowed. The next morning, he decided to act. He spoke with a few staff members who had also noticed the dog. "Does anyone know why it's here?" he asked, hoping someone might have an answer. But no one did. "It just stays there," one nurse said with a shrug. "It doesn't bother anyone. It's like it's waiting for something." Another added, "It breaks my heart, but we can't exactly bring it inside." The doctor couldn't let it go. That evening, he brought a blanket and some food, placing them gently beside the puppy. "Here you go, buddy," he whispered, stepping back to give the dog space. To his surprise, the puppy sniffed the blanket and laid down on it, as if finally accepting a small bit of comfort. But even then, his eyes stayed fixed on the hospital entrance. The following days were a whirlwind of work, but every chance he got, the doctor checked on the puppy. He noticed the dog's pattern, how it always arrived just before sunset, stayed through the night, and was gone by morning. Where did it go during the day? Why did it return only at night? The mystery deepened, pulling at the doctor's heartstrings. One night, driven by an unshakable curiosity, the doctor stayed late at the hospital, watching from a discreet distance. The puppy arrived as usual, settling into its spot. Hours passed, and the streets grew quieter. Just when the doctor thought nothing unusual would happen, the dog suddenly perked up. Its ears stood tall, and its tail wagged faintly. It stood, pacing a little, its gaze never leaving the hospital doors. The doctor's breath hitched. Was someone coming? Was this the moment the puppy had been waiting for? But no one appeared. The doors remained closed, and the street was empty. The puppy eventually sat back down, its brief burst of hope fading into a quiet, sorrowful stillness. The scene was too much for the doctor to bear. He stepped outside, his shoes echoing softly against the pavement. The puppy noticed him but didn't run away. Instead, it looked up at him with those same, heart-wrenching eyes. The doctor knelt down, reaching out a hand. The puppy hesitated before inching closer, its small nose brushing against his fingers. For the first time, it allowed itself to be touched, and the doctor felt a lump rise in his throat. "Who are you waiting for?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The puppy let out a soft whimper, leaning into his touch as if seeking solace. In that moment, the doctor felt an overwhelming urge to help, to uncover the truth behind this little dog's vigil. The next day, he made it his mission to find answers. He asked security guards if they had seen anything unusual, checked with local shelters, and even posted on social media, hoping someone might recognize the dog. But no leads came in. The mystery remained. As days turned into weeks, the doctor's connection with the puppy grew stronger. He began spending more time outside with the little dog, bringing it food, talking to it as if it could understand his words. And maybe it did, because the puppy always listened, its eyes filled with an unspoken wisdom. Yet, despite their growing bond, the dog's true purpose for being there remained a mystery. Then, one fateful night, everything changed. It was raining heavily, the kind of storm that sent most people scurrying indoors. The doctor had stayed late, finishing paperwork, when he heard a faint scratching sound near the hospital's main doors. He rushed outside and saw the puppy, drenched and shivering, pawing at the glass. The sight was almost too much to bear. Without thinking, he scooped the dog into his arms and carried it inside. As he dried the puppy off with a towel, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small, faded tag hanging from a worn collar. His heart raced as he read the barely legible name etched into the metal. It wasn't just a name, it was the key to a story he was about to uncover. The doctor stared at the tag, his mind racing. He knew this name. It was connected to a patient who had been in the hospital weeks ago. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was waiting for someone it loved, someone it had lost. And the truth of its devotion was about to shatter the doctor's heart. His hands trembled as he cradled the puppy closer, tears welling in his eyes. Whatever he was about to uncover, he knew it would change him forever. The doctor sat in his office, the small puppy curled up on a blanket at his feet. The faint sound of the rain hitting the windows filled the room, but his mind was too consumed by the mystery unraveling before him to notice. He held the tag tightly in his hand, running his fingers over the etched letters again and again, as if they might somehow change or reveal more. The name on the tag belonged to a man, someone he had treated weeks ago. The memory was still fresh, a reminder of the highs and lows that came with his profession. The man had been admitted after a tragic accident, his condition critical from the moment he arrived. The team had done everything they could, but the injuries were too severe. The man's heart had stopped in the middle of the night, leaving behind a wave of grief that swept through his family and the staff who had cared for him. The doctor remembered his face, the quiet sadness in his eyes as he clung to life in those final hours. But he hadn't known about the dog. Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? Was the dog left behind, forgotten in the chaos of losing someone so suddenly? The questions haunted him as he stared at the sleeping puppy. It made sense now, why the dog had been waiting at the hospital night after night. It wasn't just waiting for anyone, it was waiting for its owner. The realization struck the doctor hard, a knot tightening in his chest. This little creature, soaked and shivering, had been holding on to hope all this time. The doctor couldn't bring himself to leave the puppy alone that night. He wrapped it in the warmest blanket he could find and let it sleep in a corner of his office. As he watched its tiny chest rise and fall with each breath, he wondered what it must have felt like for the dog. The loss of its owner, the confusion of being left behind, the loyalty that drove it to return to the last place it had seen the person it loved. The thought was unbearable. The next morning, as the storm cleared and the city began to wake, the doctor knew he had to dig deeper. He pulled out the patient's file, searching for any clues that might explain the connection between the man and the dog. There was nothing unusual at first: basic information, medical history, emergency contacts. But then he found a note buried in the file, written by one of the nurses. It mentioned that the man had been found at the scene of the accident with the dog by his side. The doctor's heart raced as he read the words. The dog must have been there when it happened, loyal to the very end. But what happened after? Who had taken the dog away? Why had it ended up back here, alone and waiting? The questions gnawed at him as he realized the answer might lie outside the hospital walls. That day, he decided to take action. On his lunch break, he visited the address listed in the patient's file. It was a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where families built their lives in peace. But the house was empty now, its windows dark, and the mailbox overflowing with unread letters. A neighbor, seeing the doctor's car parked outside, approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice wary but kind. The doctor hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I'm looking for information about the man who used to live here," he said finally. "He was a patient at the hospital where I work." The woman's expression softened. "Oh, you mean the gentleman who passed away recently? Such a tragedy. He was a good man, always helping others." "It's been hard on the neighborhood." The doctor nodded. "I wanted to ask about his dog. I think I found it outside the hospital, but I'm not sure how it got there." The woman's eyes widened. "You mean that little pup?" "Oh, yes, it was his constant companion. They were inseparable. After the accident, I heard some people took the dog to a shelter, but I guess it must have found its way back." Poor thing, her words only deepened the doctor's sadness. The dog had been taken away, yet it had returned, guided by an unbreakable bond. How far had it traveled? How long had it searched, hoping to find its owner again? The weight of the dog's loyalty was almost too much to bear. The woman sighed, her gaze drifting to the empty house. "He didn't have much family, you know. Just a sister, but she lives out of state. I'm not sure anyone's coming back for the house." The doctor thanked her and left, his mind racing with everything he had learned. The story was becoming clearer, yet it still felt incomplete. There were pieces missing, threads he couldn't quite tie together. But one thing was certain: the dog had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Back at the hospital, the puppy greeted him with a wag of its tail, as if sensing he had been trying to help. The doctor knelt down, stroking its head gently. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" he murmured. The dog leaned into his touch, its trust growing stronger with each passing day. That evening, he made a decision. He couldn't let the dog stay out in the cold any longer. It deserved more than scraps of food and a makeshift blanket. It deserved a home, a place where it could heal and feel safe again. The doctor wasn't sure if he could fill the void left by its owner, but he was determined to try. He brought the puppy home that night, watching as it cautiously explored its new surroundings. It was a modest apartment, but it was warm and filled with kindness. The dog seemed to sense it, curling up in a corner, as if it finally felt at ease. The doctor smiled, a small flicker of hope breaking through the sadness that had gripped him for days. As the weeks passed, the dog began to thrive. Its fur grew shinier, its eyes brighter, and its tail wagged more often. But even as it adjusted to its new life, there were moments when it would sit by the door, staring out as if waiting for something or someone. The doctor understood. No matter how much time passed, the dog would never forget its first owner. And maybe it didn't have to. Maybe it was enough to keep their memory alive, to honor the bond they had shared. The doctor often thought about the man who had left such a loyal companion behind. He wondered what kind of person he had been, what kind of life he had lived. And in those quiet moments, as the dog rested at his feet, the doctor felt a profound sense of gratitude. For all the heartbreak and loss, the little dog had found its way to him, reminding him of the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Yet, even as the days grew brighter, the mystery of the dog's journey lingered. There were still unanswered questions, pieces of the story that remained just out of reach. And the doctor couldn't help but feel that the puppy's journey wasn't over yet. It was as if fate had brought them together for a reason, one that neither of them fully understood. The doctor's bond with the puppy grew stronger with each passing day, yet the weight of the unanswered questions lingered. No matter how much he tried to focus on his work, the thoughts crept in the dog's unwavering loyalty, its desperate return to the hospital, the name on the tag. There was something unfinished, something the dog was still searching for. The doctor felt it in the way the puppy sometimes sat by the window, its eyes far away, as if listening for a voice it would never hear again. One evening, as the doctor sat on the couch, the puppy curled up beside him, he decided he couldn't ignore the pull any longer. He opened his laptop and began researching. He scoured local news archives, police reports, anything that might offer clues about the man's accident and the days that followed. It was a painstaking process, but he couldn't stop. There was a story here, and he needed to understand it not just for himself, but for the little dog that had already endured so much. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he found something. It was a small, forgotten article buried in the back pages of a local newspaper. The headline read, "Man and Dog Found Together After Tragic Accident." His heart pounded as he clicked on the link. The article described the accident in sparse detail: a car skidding off a rain-slicked road, crashing into a tree. When emergency responders arrived, they found the man barely clinging to life, and beside him, a small dog refusing to leave his side. The story mentioned witnesses who had seen the aftermath. One had recalled how the dog barked and whined, as if begging the paramedics to help its owner faster. Another described how the dog tried to climb into the ambulance, how it pawed at the doors as they closed. The responders had taken the man to the hospital, but no one seemed to know what happened to the dog after that. The article ended abruptly, leaving a pit in the doctor's stomach. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The story was heartbreaking, but it didn't explain why the dog had returned to the hospital or how it had survived alone for so long. There was still so much he didn't know. Yet, as he looked down at the puppy, now peacefully sleeping, he realized something important. This wasn't just about uncovering a mystery, it was about honoring the connection between the man and his dog. The next morning, driven by a newfound determination, the doctor revisited the hospital's security office. He asked to see any footage from the days following the man's death, hoping it might reveal how the dog had returned. The guards were hesitant at first, but his persistence paid off. They pulled up the recordings, and the two of them sat in silence as the grainy black and white footage played. At first, there was nothing. Days passed with no sign of the dog. But then, on the third night, the small figure appeared. The puppy came limping down the street, its fur soaked from the rain, and stopped in front of the hospital doors. It paced back and forth, sniffing the ground, before settling into the spot it would come to call its own. The doctor watched, his chest tightening. Even in the blurry footage, he could see the desperation in the dog's movements, the way it pressed its nose to the ground as if searching for a scent, a trace of the man it had lost. But then the camera showed something unexpected. A figure appeared in the distance, a person standing across the street, watching the dog. The figure didn't approach, didn't call out, but lingered for several minutes before disappearing into the night. The doctor rewound the footage, watching the scene again and again. Who was this person? Were they connected to the dog? To the man? The questions burned in his mind. The next day, he shared the footage with a few trusted colleagues, hoping someone might recognize the mysterious figure. Most shrugged it off, dismissing it as a coincidence, but one nurse paused, her brow furrowed. "I think I've seen that person before," she said slowly. "They've been hanging around the hospital lately, mostly at night. I thought they were just another visitor, but now I'm not so sure." The doctor's pulse quickened. Could this person hold the key to the puzzle? He decided to wait outside the hospital that evening, watching from a distance as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sure enough, as night fell, a shadowy figure emerged from the alleyway across the street. They stood there silently, their eyes fixed on the hospital doors. The doctor's heart raced as he approached cautiously, the puppy trotting nervously at his side. "Excuse me," the doctor called out, his voice steady but firm. The figure turned, startled, and for a moment, their expression was unreadable. It was a young woman, her clothes worn and her face pale under the dim streetlights. She looked at the puppy, then back at the doctor, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Guilt? Sadness? Fear? "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to piece together what happened to this dog," the doctor said gently. "And I think you might know something." The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. For a long moment, she said nothing, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Then she let out a shaky breath. I've been trying to help," she admitted. "But I didn't know how. I found the dog after the accident, wandering near the scene. I took it to a shelter, thinking it would be better off. But then, I don't know. I started seeing it here again, and I realized it must have come back on its own." Her voice cracked as she continued. "I didn't know what to do. I thought about taking it home, but I couldn't. I don't have much myself. I didn't think I could give it what it needed. So I just watched. Made sure it was okay." The doctor felt a wave of emotions wash over him: relief, compassion, but also a deep sadness for both the woman and the dog. "You've done more than you realize," he said softly. "But this dog doesn't need just food or shelter. It needs closure. It's still holding on to something, and I think we owe it to both of them, the man and the dog, to figure out what that is." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Together, they began to talk, piecing together the fragments of the story. The woman shared what little she knew about the man: how he had been a regular at a nearby park, always seen with the puppy by his side, how he often stopped to talk with strangers, his warmth leaving an impression on everyone he met. She described the moments after the accident, how the dog had stayed by his side despite the chaos, refusing to leave even as the ambulance sped away. As the night deepened, the doctor and the woman formed a fragile alliance, united by their shared goal of uncovering the truth. The puppy, sensing their determination, stayed close, its eyes filled with a quiet understanding. But even as they grew closer to the heart of the mystery, the doctor couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much bigger, something that would change everything they thought they knew. As the conversation deepened under the faint glow of the streetlights, the woman hesitated, as though she were holding back something important. Her eyes darted to the puppy and then back to the doctor, uncertainty flickering across her face. The doctor noticed, his instincts sharpened by years of reading subtle shifts in people's emotions. He leaned in slightly, his voice calm but probing. "Is there something else you're not telling me? Something about the man? Or the dog?" The woman shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the weight of the question. For a long moment, it seemed she might not answer. But then, with a sigh that carried years of buried emotion, she nodded. "I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure," she began quietly. "But there was something strange about that night. After the ambulance left, I saw someone else at the scene. A man. He wasn't with the responders, and he didn't look like a bystander either. He was dressed too sharply for that. At first, I thought he might be a family member, but the way he acted. Her voice trailed off as she shook her head. It didn't sit right. He was looking for something frantically, like he'd lost something. And when he couldn't find it, he just disappeared into the night. The doctor frowned, the new details sending his thoughts racing. Who was this man? What was he searching for? And why hadn't anyone else mentioned him? The woman seemed to sense his unease, her expression softening as she added, I thought it wasn't important. But now, seeing you here, trying to figure this all out, I think maybe it was. The doctor nodded, his mind spinning with possibilities. It was a small detail, but it added a new layer of complexity to the story. Could this man have had something to do with the accident? Or was he connected to the owner in some other way? The questions gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into the mystery. The next morning, the doctor decided to dig further. He contacted the police station, hoping to access the original accident report. After a bit of back and forth, an officer finally provided him with the file. As the doctor flipped through the pages, a chilling detail caught his eye. There had been no skid marks on the road where the car had crashed. The report suggested that the driver hadn't lost control due to the rain, as everyone had assumed, but that the car might have been forced off the road. The idea sent a shiver down his spine. Was it possible the accident hadn't been an accident at all? The doctor stared at the report, his pulse quickening. If someone had caused the crash, who were they, and why? The man's death suddenly felt much less random, and the presence of the mysterious figure at the scene now seemed more significant than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that the dog, in its own way, had witnessed more than anyone realized. That evening, as he returned home, the doctor noticed something unusual. A car he didn't recognize was parked across the street from his apartment. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it, but now, after everything he'd learned, it struck him as odd. The driver sat motionless, their face hidden by the shadows. The doctor felt a prickle of unease but forced himself to stay calm. Inside, the puppy greeted him with its usual enthusiasm, its tail wagging as it brought him a chewed-up slipper. The sight eased his tension. Momentarily, but the questions lingered in the back of his mind. Who was watching him? And what did they want? The next day, the woman called him, her voice shaky and urgent. I think I've seen that man again, she said. The one from the night of the accident. He was at the park, near where the crash happened. The doctor's heart skipped a beat. Did he see you? I don't think so, she replied. But he was talking to someone. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they looked serious. Like they were planning something. The tension in the doctor's chest tightened. This was more than a coincidence. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was darker than he'd anticipated. Whoever this man was, he seemed determined to stay in the shadows. As night fell, the doctor found himself unable to sleep. He sat on the couch, the puppy resting beside him, as he replayed everything in his mind. The mysterious figure at the scene of the crash, the absence of skid marks, the strange car outside his apartment, none of it added up. And yet he felt certain that the answers were within reach. Just as he was drifting into an uneasy sleep, a sudden noise jolted him awake. The puppy leaped to its feet, barking furiously at the door. The doctor's heart pounded as he got up, peering through the peephole. There was no one there, but a small envelope had been slipped under the door. He picked it up cautiously, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the man from the accident, smiling with the puppy by his side. But the background caught the doctor's attention, a park bench with a clear view of the crash site. And scribbled on the back of the photo was a chilling message: some bonds aren't meant to be broken. Stop looking. The doctor felt a cold chill run down his spine. Someone knew he was digging into the past, and they wanted him to stop. But why? And what were they so desperate to hide? As the puppy whimpered at his feet, the doctor realized that the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The truth was out there, but uncovering it might come at a cost neither he nor the dog could anticipate. The doctor stared at the photograph in his hands, the ominous words scrawled on the back burning into his mind. He felt the weight of the threat but knew he couldn't walk away. Whoever had left this message didn't realize one thing: he wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for the little dog that had endured so much and for the memory of the man whose story was still untold. The next morning, he met with the woman again. He showed her the photograph, and her face paled as she looked at it. "That's the man I saw," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but there was a determination in her eyes. "We need to find him." Together, they decided to return to the park where the accident had happened. The doctor brought the puppy, hoping its presence might stir something or lead them closer to the truth. As they walked through the quiet paths, the puppy suddenly stopped, its ears perked up. It sniffed the air and began pulling on the leash, leading them toward a secluded area near the trees. What they found there sent chills down their spines. Hidden among the underbrush was a small, weathered briefcase, partially buried beneath leaves and dirt. The doctor hesitated before opening it, his hands shaking. Inside, they found stacks of documents, photographs, and a sleek, black notebook. Flipping through the notebook, the doctor quickly realized it wasn't just any journal, it was filled with records, names, and dates. The woman leaned in, her voice hushed. "This looks like evidence. Maybe the man who died wasn't just an ordinary person. Maybe someone wanted him gone." The doctor nodded, his mind racing. The notes in the journal detailed transactions, some of them marked with red circles. One name appeared repeatedly, circled heavily: the man in the photograph. It was clear now this wasn't a random accident. It was a deliberate act to silence someone who had uncovered something dangerous. Just then, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. The doctor and the woman turned, their hearts pounding, as the man from the photograph emerged from the shadows. His face was hard, his eyes sharp as they darted between them and the briefcase. "You should have left this alone," he said, his voice low and threatening. The doctor stood his ground, the puppy growling softly at his side. "Why?" he demanded. "Why go to such lengths? What was so important that you had to destroy a life?" The man hesitated, his expression flickering with something almost like regret. "It wasn't supposed to end like that," he said finally. "He was just supposed to back off. But he didn't. He was too stubborn, too determined to expose everything." The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "And the dog? Did you ever think about what you were doing to it? You took away the only family it had." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But then the puppy did something unexpected. It stepped forward, wagging its tail cautiously, as if recognizing the man. The tension in the air shifted, and the man's hardened expression softened ever so slightly. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want any of this. I just followed orders." The doctor seized the moment. "You can still make it right," he said firmly. "Whatever this is about, it's not too late to come clean. Help us understand. Help us bring the truth to light." For a long moment, the man stood frozen, torn between his fear and whatever humanity he had left. Finally, he nodded. "There's a recording," he admitted. "It proves everything. I hid it near the accident site. I didn't think anyone would ever find it." He led them to another hidden spot in the park, where a small, waterproof container was buried beneath a tree. Inside was a flash drive. The doctor's hands trembled as he held it, knowing it contained the key to unraveling the entire mystery. But just as relief began to set in, the sound of tires screeching nearby shattered the calm. A dark car sped toward them, its windows tinted, and the doctor realized too late that they weren't alone. The woman screamed as the car came to a halt, and two men stepped out, their faces cold and unyielding. "You've gone too far," one of them said, his voice icy. "Hand it over." The doctor clutched the flash drive tightly, his mind racing for a way out. But before anyone could react, the puppy darted forward, barking ferociously. The distraction was enough for the woman to grab a branch and swing it at one of the men, buying the doctor a precious few seconds to act. He bolted, running toward the busy street with the flash drive in hand, the men close on his heels. The woman followed with the puppy, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The chase ended abruptly when a police car, alerted by a bystander, pulled up with sirens blaring. The men froze, their expressions shifting to panic as officers stepped out. One of them quickly detained the men while the doctor handed over the flash drive, explaining everything as best as he could. In the days that followed, the contents of the flash drive were made public, exposing a network of corruption that reached higher than anyone had imagined. The man from the photograph, now in custody, became a key witness, his testimony shedding light on the tangled web of deceit. But the final twist came when the doctor received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer representing the deceased man. Enclosed was a handwritten note addressed to the doctor, written long before the man's untimely death. "If you're reading this, it means you've found the truth. Take care of her, my little companion. She's more than just a dog, she's a reminder of what matters most. Loyalty, love, and the courage to stand for what's right." The doctor looked down at the puppy, now wagging its tail at his feet, and felt a lump rise in his throat. The man's words echoed in his mind as he realized the depth of the bond that had brought them all together. The dog had been more than a witness to tragedy, it had been a guardian of hope, guiding them to uncover the truth. And as the doctor knelt to hug the little dog, he knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time, it felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for the doctor. News of the exposed corruption and the mysterious flash drive spread quickly, drawing the attention of local media and the public. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping for a statement from the man who had stumbled into this tangled web. The doctor avoided them, choosing instead to focus on the little dog that had become his constant companion. He often thought about the man who had written the note, the one who had lost his life far too soon. Though the details of the case were still being unraveled, one thing had become clear: the man had been fighting a battle against forces much larger than himself, risking everything to bring the truth to light. The flash drive had been his final act of defiance, and the puppy, unknowingly, had been his messenger. The woman, too, found herself reflecting on her role in the story. She had only intended to share what she'd seen that night, but her decision to speak up had changed everything. The bond she'd formed with the doctor and the puppy during their journey was unexpected but deeply meaningful. She started visiting the hospital more often, not for medical reasons, but to spend time with them and to help care for the dog. The authorities eventually pieced together the full story. The man who had died in the crash was a whistleblower, a former employee of a powerful corporation with deep ties to illicit activities. He had uncovered evidence of their wrongdoing and had been working to expose them. When his life was threatened, he'd taken precautions, hiding the flash drive in case anything happened to him. The corporation, desperate to keep its secrets, had sent someone to silence him. The crash wasn't an accident, it had been staged to look like one. But in their rush to cover their tracks, they hadn't accounted for the man's dog, who had witnessed everything. The dog's nightly vigil outside the hospital had been its way of staying close to its owner, refusing to let go of the bond they'd shared. The man who had threatened the doctor and the woman turned out to be a hired operative working for the corporation. His decision to reveal the location of the flash drive had been a rare moment of conscience, a crack in the hardened exterior he'd built over years of working in the shadows. Though he now faced charges, his cooperation helped bring down the corrupt network that had caused so much harm. As the dust settled, the doctor found himself thinking about what the experience had taught him. He had started this journey out of simple curiosity, driven by the sight of a loyal dog waiting outside the hospital. But it had turned into something far greater, a lesson about resilience, loyalty, and the power of standing up for what's right. The puppy, now officially adopted by the doctor, seemed to sense the shift. It no longer waited outside the hospital at night, choosing instead to curl up by the doctor's side, content and at peace. Its tail wagged with new energy, its once wary eyes now bright with trust. One afternoon, as the doctor walked through the park with the puppy, he found himself reflecting on the letter. The man had called the dog a reminder of loyalty, love, and courage. And he was right. The puppy had been a silent witness to incredible acts of bravery and sacrifice, and its presence had brought together people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. The woman joined them at the park, carrying a bag of treats for the dog. She smiled as she approached, her expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "How's our little hero today?" she asked, kneeling to scratch behind the puppy's ears. "Better than ever," the doctor replied, watching the dog wag its tail. "I think we're all better now." The woman nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small can change so much." The doctor smiled. "It's not strange at all. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, the doctor felt a sense of closure. The journey had been difficult, but it had brought them to a place of understanding and peace. The puppy had found a new family, and the man's sacrifice had not been in vain. Life slowly returned to normal, though it was forever changed. The doctor continued his work at the hospital, now with the puppy by his side as a therapy dog, bringing comfort to patients and staff alike. The woman, inspired by the experience, started volunteering with animal shelters, helping other dogs find homes and families who would love them. The story of the loyal puppy and the mysterious crash became a legend in the town, a tale people told to remind themselves of the importance of loyalty and courage. And though the details of the case faded with time, the lessons it taught remained. One evening, as the doctor sat on his porch with the dog at his feet, he looked out at the quiet street and thought about how far they had come. The dog's gentle breathing filled the air, a soothing rhythm that reminded him of the bond they now shared. The doctor reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We did it, didn't we?" he murmured. The dog looked up at him, its eyes full of trust and gratitude. In that moment, the doctor realized that the journey wasn't just about finding the truth or seeking justice. It was about connection between people, between a man and a dog, and between the past and the present. The puppy stretched out beside him, its tail thumping softly against the porch. And as the stars began to fill the night sky, the doctor felt a quiet contentment settle over him. They had found their way through the darkness, and now, they were finally home.